Notice the instruction includes Nan. I'll treat that as a stray note and proceed with the full story. I knew something was wrong the first time he asked about the deed. Not because the question itself was strange. People ask about property all the time. Neighbors, real estate agents, curious friends. But there was something in the way he asked it. Too casual. Too practiced. Like he'd been rehearsing the question in the car on the drive over and was proud of how naturally it came out. I let it go. I told myself I was being unfair. I'm 63 years old. I've been told more than once that I trust too slowly and forgive too quickly, and that those two things together make for a complicated life. My late husband Robert used to say I had the instincts of a hawk and the patience of a saint, and that one day those two things were going to contradict each other at exactly the wrong moment. He wasn't wrong. He usually wasn't. Robert passed 4 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, 8 weeks from diagnosis to the end. We had 41 years together, a house on 11 acres outside Asheville, North Carolina, and one son, our boy Wesley, who was 34 when his father died and took it harder than he let anyone see. Wesley is quiet that way. He holds things inside and smiles on the outside, and sometimes the smile is so convincing that you forget to check whether the rest of him is okay. I checked. I always checked. It's what mothers do. What I did not do, what I failed to do, and I have to be honest about this, was check carefully enough when Amber came into the picture. She appeared about 14 months after Robert died. Wesley brought her to Sunday dinner one evening in late October, and she walked through my front door carrying a bottle of wine and a smile that could light up a room. She was 31, tall, with auburn hair and the kind of easy confidence that makes you want to be near someone. She complimented my kitchen. She asked about the photographs on the wall. She sat across from me at the table and looked at my son the way every mother hopes someone will look at her child. I liked her. I want to be clear about that because it matters. I genuinely liked her. This is not a story about a mother who never approved. I approved. I was glad. Wesley had been so gray since losing his father, so diminished, and Amber seemed to bring color back into him. He laughed differently around her. He stood up straighter. I was grateful to her for that. The first question about the property came 6 weeks in. We were sitting on the back porch after dinner, the three of us, watching the sun drop behind the ridge. Amber had been quiet for a few minutes, looking out at the tree line, and then she turned to me and said, very pleasantly, "Where exactly does your property end, Judith?" Judith. That's me. I pointed toward the old fence post by the creek and told her the 11 acres ran from there to the road. She nodded, asked if I'd ever thought about selling any of it. I said no. This land had been in Robert's family for 2 generations, and I intended to leave it to Wesley someday. She smiled and said that was lovely, and we moved on. I didn't think about it again for 2 weeks. The second time, she asked whether I had a mortgage on the house. We were in my kitchen, just the two of us. Wesley was out checking on a noise in the barn. She phrased it gently, like she was making conversation. Something about interest rates being so strange lately, and wasn't it hard for people our age to plan ahead? I told her the house had been paid off for 11 years. She nodded again. That same pleasant nod. The third time was at Christmas. She asked in front of Wesley what he thought the property was worth now with the market the way it was. Wesley laughed it off and changed the subject, and I watched her face while he did. Just for a second, something moved behind her eyes. Not embarrassment, recalculation. That was the word that came to me later that night when I couldn't sleep. Recalculation. I am a retired nurse, 31 years in cardiac care at Mission Hospital. You spend 3 decades watching people manage fear and pain and uncertainty. You get very good at reading the face beneath the face. The expression people wear for the room, and the expression they can't quite control when they think no one is paying attention. Amber had a beautiful face for the room, but in the small moments, in the half seconds between one expression and the next, there was something calculating that she couldn't entirely hide. I started paying closer attention. In February, Wesley told me he and Amber were looking at buying a place together. Nothing serious yet, just browsing. My immediate thought, the one I pushed down because I didn't want to be that mother, was that they'd only been together 4 months. But people move quickly these days. I kept my mouth shut and asked if they'd found anything they liked. He said they'd looked at a few places, but the prices were difficult. Then he said something that sat wrong with me for days afterward. He said Amber had mentioned that if they pooled resources with family, they might be able to afford something much nicer. I asked what he meant by pooling resources. He got vague, said it was just something she brought up, probably nothing. I told him I loved him and I'd support whatever he decided. And then I called my attorney the next morning. Her name is Carol. We've known each other 20 years. I told her I wanted to make sure my estate documents were current and airtight, and that I wanted to understand exactly what my exposure would be if, hypothetically, a family member attempted to make a claim on the property through a domestic partnership or marriage. Carol asked me a few careful questions. Then she said, "Judith, do you want to tell me what's actually going on?" I told her. All of it. The questions about the deed, the property value, the pooling resources comment. Carol listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You're right to be cautious. Let's make sure everything is protected." We updated my will. We placed the property and the majority of my assets into a trust that Wesley himself could not access without specific conditions, and that a spouse or partner would have no automatic claim to under any circumstances. I didn't tell Wesley. I needed to understand more before I said anything to him, and I was afraid, genuinely afraid, that if I voiced my suspicions too early, he would defend her and pull away from me, and I would lose the ability to protect him. I hated feeling that way, afraid of my own son pulling away. But I held it. March brought something I hadn't anticipated. I have a doctor, a GP I've seen for 12 years, a steady man named Dr. Ellison who knows my entire medical history. His receptionist called me on a Tuesday afternoon to confirm my appointment the following week. I told her I didn't have an appointment scheduled. There was a pause. She said someone had called the office that morning, identified themselves as my daughter-in-law, and asked about rescheduling my annual cognitive assessment. I don't have a daughter-in-law. Wesley and Amber were not married. We're not even engaged at that point. I kept my voice even and told the receptionist there must have been a misunderstanding, and I'd call back to schedule my own appointment. I hung up. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time. Cognitive assessment. She was building something. I could feel the shape of it even if I couldn't see all the pieces yet. A question about the property here, a comment about pooling resources there, and now a quiet, unauthorized inquiry to my physician about my mental capacity. She was laying groundwork for what exactly, I could only guess. Some future claim that I had made decisions while not fully competent, perhaps. That anything I signed or didn't sign was the product of a diminished mind. I called Carol again. I told her about the call to Dr. Ellison's office. She was very still on the other end of the line, and then she said, "Judith, this is more serious than I initially thought." We made a plan. I also, for the first time, started to wonder whether Wesley knew. I don't mean whether he was in on it deliberately. I know my son. Whatever flaws he has, and he has them as all people do, he is not a person who would scheme to take from his own mother. But I wondered whether Amber had said things to him, planted ideas, framed my autonomy as something fragile, something that needed managing. I wondered whether she had been slowly, carefully adjusting the way he saw me. I needed to know. So I did something that felt like a betrayal, even though I believe it was the right choice. I invited Wesley to lunch without Amber, and I asked him directly whether he had any concerns about my health or my ability to manage my own affairs. He looked surprised. He said no, of course not. Then something shifted in his face and he said, "Why? Has someone said something?" I asked him if Amber had ever mentioned anything like that to him. He was quiet for just a beat too long. Then he said she'd mentioned once, after Thanksgiving, that she thought I seemed overwhelmed, that the property might be a lot for me to manage alone at my age, that maybe it would make sense at some point to think about simplifying. Simplifying. I looked at my son across that restaurant table and I made myself breathe. He was not the enemy. He was a grieving man who loved a woman who had been feeding him a story, one small sentence at a time, for months. I recognized it now with complete clarity. She wasn't just pursuing my assets, she was engineering my son's perception of me so that when the moment came, he would be on her side. I told him I appreciated him being honest with me. I told him I loved him. I did not tell him everything I knew. I went home and I called Carol and I told her I was ready to move forward. We had everything we needed by mid-April. Carol had connected me with a private investigator who found, within 10 days, that Amber had been involved in a civil lawsuit in Georgia 4 years prior. An elderly man, a widower, 71, had filed against her claiming she had manipulated him into changing his estate documents naming her as sole beneficiary, then disappeared when he survived a health scare that had apparently prompted the changes. The case had been settled out of court. She had paid back a portion of what she'd received. There had been no criminal charge. She had done this before. I sat with that for a long evening. I thought about that man in Georgia. I thought about whether anyone had warned him, whether anyone had seen what I was seeing and said something in time. I thought about Robert and what he would say if he could see what was happening in the house he'd spent 40 years building. I think he would say, "Handle it." So that's what I did. Wesley and Amber had been talking about a joint purchase more seriously in recent weeks, a property in the county, something they'd look at together. Amber had suggested, through Wesley, that it would be a wonderful gesture if I contributed to the down payment, a gift, to help them get started. She had a number in mind, $60,000. I said I would think about it. I told Wesley I'd like to sit down with them both and go over everything together. Talk through the property, my plans, the potential gift, before I made any decisions. I said I wanted us all to be on the same page. Wesley thought this was very reasonable. Amber, when he relayed it to her, agreed immediately, enthusiastically. We scheduled it for a Saturday afternoon. My house. Carol came. I had told Wesley she was coming as my attorney to help make sure any financial gift was documented properly for tax purposes. He thought that was thorough but reasonable. Amber, when she arrived that afternoon, seemed pleased. A gift being formalized. Paperwork. It was all going according to her plan. She sat down at my kitchen table and she smiled at me with that warm, practiced smile, and I thought, you have done this before. You have sat across from someone's mother in someone's kitchen and smiled exactly like this, and you thought it would work again. She opened by saying how glad she was that we were doing this as a family, how much she loved Wesley, how she wanted us all to be close for the long term. She reached across the table and put her hand over mine and said she hoped I knew how much she cared about my well-being. I let her finish. Then I said, "I know you called Dr. Ellison's office in February." The smile didn't disappear. That's the thing people don't expect. It didn't vanish. It just tightened, just slightly, just enough. She said she wasn't sure what I meant. I said, "You identified yourself as my daughter-in-law and asked about my cognitive assessment schedule. You and Wesley aren't married. You've never been to that office. There is only one reason to make that call." Wesley was looking at her, saying her name. Amber, Amber, what is she talking about? She pivoted immediately. She said she had done it out of concern, that she worried about me living alone, that she'd been trying to be helpful, that she hadn't meant any harm. She looked at Wesley and her eyes went soft, and she said she was sorry she hadn't mentioned it. She just hadn't wanted to worry him. Carol slid a folder across the table. Inside was the documentation from the Georgia lawsuit, the name of the man, the dates, the settlement amount, the attorney of record. I watched Amber look down at that folder and I watched her understand that the room had changed. Wesley read it. It took him a while. When he looked up, his face was very still in the way. Faces go still when the mind is rearranging itself around something it doesn't want to be true. Amber said it was a misunderstanding, that the man in Georgia had been confused, that it had been a difficult situation that was taken out of context. I said, "You asked about my deed in October. You asked if I had a mortgage in November. You asked what the land was worth at Christmas. You contacted my physician without authorization. And you were sued for financial manipulation of an elderly widower in Georgia in 2019. Wesley said her name again, but differently this time. What happened next was not loud. That surprised me. Later, when I thought about it, I had expected loud. Amber did not shout or cry or collapse into apology. She sat very straight and she looked at me with something that was almost like respect. And then she said very quietly that she thought she should leave. She picked up her bag. She stood up. She looked at Wesley for a long moment, and I could see her considering whether there was anything left to say, whether there was any angle she hadn't yet tried, and then she seemed to decide there wasn't, and she walked to the door and she left. Wesley didn't move for a long time. I got up and made coffee because I didn't know what else to do with my hands. I put a cup in front of him, and I sat back down and I waited. Outside the kitchen window, the property stretched out the way it always has, the old fence line at the edge of the creek, the ridge beyond it catching the afternoon light. 11 acres. That 2 generations of this family built something on, that I am going to pass to my son intact, the way it was given to us. Wesley cried. Not immediately. About 10 minutes later, when it all settled in, he put his face in his hands and he cried the way he'd cried when his father died. Quietly, with enormous effort, like he was trying to keep it from taking him over entirely. I put my hand on his back and I didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that the moment didn't already say better. He looked up after a while and he said, "How long did you know?" I told him. All of it. The timeline, Carol, the investigator, the Georgia case, every step. He listened and he didn't interrupt. And when I finished, he was quiet for a moment. And then he said, "You didn't tell me because you thought I'd defend her." I said yes. He said, "You were probably right." We sat there together for a long time. The coffee went cold. We made a second pot. We talked about his father, which we hadn't done in months, and we talked about the property and what it meant and what Robert had wanted for it, and for Wesley, and at some point the afternoon turned to early evening and neither of us noticed until the kitchen got dim. I have thought a lot since then about what I would say to the 71-year-old man in Georgia, whether anyone sat across from him the way I sat across from my son that afternoon, whether he had someone who noticed in time. I hope he did. I don't know. What I know is this. I am 63 years old and I live alone on 11 acres outside Asheville that I will not be signing over to anyone. I am not confused or overwhelmed or in need of simplifying. I raised a son who, once he understood what had happened, did not flinch from the truth even when it hurt him badly. Robert would have been proud of him. I think he would have been a little proud of me, too. If you are watching this and you have a parent who lives alone, check on them. Not just the obvious things. Check who is asking about their assets. Check who is making themselves indispensable. Check who frames your parents' independence as a problem to be managed. Do it before you need to. The note I never had to receive. The warning I gave myself. Some people aren't that lucky. We were, just barely. But we were. I've been sitting with this story for a while now, turning it over the way you turn over a stone you almost stepped on without looking down. The close call stays with you. Not the drama of it, the quiet of what almost happened. Amber didn't fail because I was smarter than her. I want to be honest about that. She failed because she underestimated one thing, that a person who has spent 31 years reading people in crisis does not stop reading them just because she retired. The skills we build through hard, unglamorous work don't disappear. They go quiet sometimes, but they're still there. That's what I mean when I say there's a kind of cause and effect that has nothing to do with luck. What you build in yourself over decades, patience, observation, the willingness to trust your own perception even when the easier thing is to dismiss it. That becomes the wall between you and the people who count on you not having it. Amber had counted on me being a lonely widow who wanted to believe someone loved her son. She wasn't wrong that the loneliness was real. She was wrong that it made me blind. Wesley asked me once after everything settled whether I felt guilty for not telling him sooner. I told him the truth, yes, a little. Not for protecting him, for the weeks when I wondered whether he already knew. That suspicion, even unspoken, was a small betrayal of who I know him to be. He forgave me for it before I finished the sentence. That's the person he is. His father raised him that way, and I like to think I had something to do with it too. What I keep coming back to is this. The people who scheme the way Amber schemed are not extraordinary. They are ordinary people who have learned to exploit the ordinary human need to be trusted. They move slowly. They build warmth before they build leverage. And they genuinely count on the idea that the people around them will be too polite, too loving, or too afraid of conflict to look directly at what is happening. The answer to that is not suspicion of everyone. It's not closing yourself off or refusing to let people in. I don't believe that's any kind of life. The answer is what I've come to think of as clear-eyed kindness, being warm and being watchful at the same time, noticing the small things, trusting the feeling in your chest when something doesn't sit right, even when you can't yet articulate why. And if you're the adult child watching this, if you have a parent who lives alone and has built something over a lifetime, please ask them how they're doing and mean it. Notice who is suddenly very interested in what they own. Not every kind stranger is a threat, but the ones who are will show you, if you're paying attention. The pattern is almost always the same. Questions about assets early, isolation quietly, and by the time it's obvious, the groundwork is already laid. I was 63 and I caught it in time. 11 acres still carry my name. My son sat in my kitchen and cried, and then we made coffee and talked about his father for the first time in months. That's what it looks like when things go right. I hope you never need to know what the other version looks like. But if you're already worried, trust that. Don't wait.